Well, hello again, students. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your devoted teacher and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. Now, by this point in the year, some of you have doubtless discovered the button which lets you watch presentations at 1.5 or 2.0 speed. Congratulations on your ingenuity. But if you're watching this right now at 2.0 speed, or while you're using your telephonic device for some non-scholarly purposes, slow it down, maybe to 1.0, and put that phone away. Because great notes require careful and close attention. And great notes are going to be the keys to your great scores, both on your next test and on the AP exam. As we come to the very end of an incredibly long slideshow, this one called The Birth and Early Childhood of a New Nation, it feels like this nation has really just grown up. It's really no longer a child. It's grown up in so much in just a few years. We've doubled our size, we've endured another war with Britain, and we've come out of it seemingly bigger and stronger. But if you can look closely, you can see some conflicts emerging. Call them growing pains, if you will, or maybe middle school. But given the competing trends of nationalism and sectionalism, we have to ask ourselves, is the United States going to be able to overcome its sectional differences and emerge even bigger, even stronger? Or would we pull ourselves apart and descend into conflict and maybe even civil war? Let's find out. Well, you will recall that economic and political stability are linked. But it's also true that economic issues and international relations can be linked too. After all, the United States went to quasi-war with the French over freedom of the seas and then attacked the Barbary States for interfering with its international trade. And then, of course, both the British and the French started seizing American vessels and impressing American sailors into military service. The U.S. responded to these latest challenges first by passing the Embargo Act of 1807 and then the entirely useless Non-Intercourse Act, before settling on Macon's Bill No. 2. Which is, of course, the thing that brought us into an uncomfortable trade relationship with the French and, of course, war with the British. Oh, and while all of those things were hurting the American economy, Congress decided to let the original charter for Hamilton's Bank of the United States expire. And so without a strong central bank, the economy lurched from crisis to crisis, a fact not at all helped by the burning of Washington and the near capture of New Orleans. So our country was already in a pretty weakened state by the time that the war ended. And that's bad, because while war tends to be pretty good for business, with government paying soldiers and buying guns and uniforms, the end of war is usually really bad for business, as orders for guns and uniforms get canceled, and when soldiers return to the workforce, resulting in too many people struggling to fill too few jobs. And that's why you can usually count on an economic bust or a downturn to follow pretty much every war we fight across American history. And that is exactly what happened in 1815. And we didn't have a strong central bank to help the country deal with the economic strain. And so maybe that's why in 1816, Congress, yes, the same Congress that had just let the first bank die back in 1811, they realized, just kidding, we actually do need a national bank. And thus they created the aptly named Second Bank of the United States. At the same time, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816, which, like all tariffs, was designed to protect American producers and exporters. In theory, all of the revenue from tariffs collected on imports could be put in the new Second Bank of the United States. But problems quickly emerged. First, other countries hit the United States with retaliatory tariffs, which made it harder for the U.S. to export products to those countries. And this brings me to an important lesson. Tariffs almost never work as intended. Sure, they might actually protect industries in the very, very short run, but in the long run, the overall effect is that they gum up the international commerce and they weaken the overall American economy. So please remember that the next time someone tells you that tariffs are good for the country. The combination of protective tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs that other countries imposed on the U.S., and chronic mismanagement of the Second Bank of the United States led to an economic crisis called the Panic of 1819. It's just as bad as it sounds. The bank had been giving out too many loans too freely to people and to businesses who couldn't repay those loans. And when they defaulted, it weakened the bank and the overall economy, hence the Panic of 1819. Well, eventually the panic subsided and the economy returned to equilibrium, but the damage had been done. Many state banks and private banks resented the size and power of the Second Bank of the United States, suggesting that a national entity couldn't possibly protect the interests of people in all of the different regions of the country. And they had a point. Indeed, northern states called for more protective tariffs because they were industrializing earlier than the other regions, and so they stood to benefit from tariffs more immediately. Meanwhile, southern states, which produced goods that, like wheat and cotton, that the country exported and thus were subject to retaliatory tariffs, they hated the tariff of 1816 and they wanted all tariffs removed. Meanwhile, new states out west, like Kentucky and Ohio, they didn't really care about tariffs so much because they first needed to be connected to the rest of the economy, which couldn't happen without internal improvements. These are roads and canals and things that might allow products to flow to and from the region of the West more freely. But how could any bank, or frankly any politician, hope to unify all of these contradictory interests? I don't know, but I do know someone who tried. Henry Clay. You might remember him as a war hawk from Kentucky, urging President Madison to fight the British so that the United States could gain more land out west and in Canada. Well, now he turned his attention to the American economy in the post-war period, and he developed a plan with the creative title, The American System. What he proposed was a system that promoted economic independence, that is, strength and self-sufficiency by means of regional interdependence. Essentially, if the regions worked together, then we wouldn't need to worry about foreign tariffs or competition. We could just rely on each other. And this is how it would work. First, the northeastern industrial states would benefit from a continuation of protective tariffs. However, the southern states would benefit too, because even if they were hit by foreign tariffs on their raw materials, they could just send their product north to be processed in the new factories up there. Now, the money collected by the protective tariffs would be put into the Second Bank of the United States, which could then use that money to build internal improvements connecting the West to the rest of the U.S. economy. And so if the West grew strong, then it would help the North and the South, and the whole country would benefit. See how this works? Henry Clay thought this idea was just what the country needed, and perhaps even more importantly, he thought he was what the country needed as he prepared to run for president in the year 1824. But before we get too deep into the weeds of regional politics, we need to revisit the Supreme Court, where a series of incredibly consequential decisions would help to determine whether the country would have a strong national government and economy or revert to states' rights and regional disputes. Of course, the Supreme Court continued to be ruled over by Chief Justice John Marshall. You remember him from Marbury v. Madison back in 1803, but he would actually stay on that same job for another 32 years until his death in 1835. So what did the Marshall Court look like? Well, in short, it continued to maintain its reputation for being an independent branch of the government, unmoved by political or economic changes. And Marshall held such sway and influence over his fellow justices that often their decisions were unanimous, something we almost never see these days. But if there's one word that defines Marshall's philosophy, it's nationalism. Like the old Federalist he was, Marshall would continue to broadly interpret Congress's power, their lawmaking power in Article 1, Section 8, especially the necessary and proper clause, in order to expand and solidify national supremacy over state laws. Let's take a quick look at 3 such cases that helped Marshall achieve these goals. First case is McCulloch v. Maryland, and it dealt with the question of whether or not the Bank of the United States was constitutional at all. Now, you might remember that private banks and state banks were resentful of the power that the Second Bank of the United States had. And so Maryland passed a law trying to help out its own smaller local banks, saying that banks not chartered in Maryland, like the Second Bank of the United States, were subject to a state tax. And as you might remember, all court cases seek to answer 1 or 2 basic questions. And so in this case, the questions were, first, is it constitutional to create a Bank of the United States in the first place? And you'll remember that this is something we've been yelling at for a couple of decades. This was one of the reasons Thomas Jefferson broke off and started his own political party in the 1790s, because he felt a bank was not both necessary and proper. Now, the second question is, are states allowed to impose taxes on national entities? Well, Marshall's response to these questions was entirely predictable. He said, well, yes, of course the bank is constitutional. Marshall argued that this wasn't an expressed power of Congress, but an implied power. Sure, the Constitution didn't specifically authorize the creation of a bank, but it did give Congress the power to collect taxes and tariffs. And so it would be only logical for the money it collected to be put somewhere. Why not a national bank? The power to create a national bank was implied and therefore constitutional. Now, the second question was thornier, but here again, Marshall asserted his belief in national supremacy. If Maryland were allowed to impose a tax on a national entity, well, essentially that would be like children setting rules that parents would have to abide by. So in this particular situation, a state like Maryland could just raise the tax rate on a bank like the Bank of the United States so high that it would be impossible for that bank to even operate. Or as Marshall put it, the power to tax involves the power to destroy. See, once you have the right to tax, you can raise those taxes and eventually raise them so high as to drive them out of business, which is surely what Maryland wanted to do with the Second Bank of the United States. And Marshall stepped in to stop that. In so doing, the Supreme Court expanded Congress's power over the states and over the national economy. Well, the next case was Gibbons v. Ogden, which is commonly referred to as the steamboat case, for reasons that will become obvious in just a moment. In the early part of the 19th century, a steamboat company was given an exclusive license, that is, a monopoly by the state of New York, to operate a steamboat service between New York and New Jersey. This license was eventually sold to a man named Aaron Ogden, who was upset to learn that another steamboat company was operating in the same waters in violation of Ogden's monopoly. That other company, run by Thomas Gibbons, contended that it didn't need to abide by the state of New York's license because it was operating using a license from the federal government. And besides, the service crossed state lines, and so it should be the purview of the federal government, not the state of New York. And so, the case of Gibbons v. Ogden came to the Supreme Court, and it had to answer this question. Can one state regulate trade that goes on between states? And here, the court's decision was as obvious as it was emphatic. No, Congress was given the exclusive right to regulate interstate commerce. So New York's attempt to do just that by granting a monopoly to one steamboat company was illegal. And so Gibbons won, and it was yet another victory for national supremacy in its battle with states' rights. Now, when you see Dartmouth, many of you think safety school, and I get that. But what you need to know is that this elite Ivy League school in New Hampshire was created way back before the American Revolution, when the founders gained a charter from the king. In the years after the United States gained its independence, some states, like North Carolina and Virginia, founded state universities to educate their young people. New Hampshire thought this was a great idea, but rather than start from scratch, they thought, well, maybe we can just cancel that pre-revolutionary charter and then take over the school, and then poof, just like that, New Hampshire would have a new state college. Unsurprisingly, Dartmouth didn't want the state to take them over. And so graduates of Dartmouth, including Daniel Webster, argued that New Hampshire did not have the power. It could not just cancel the contract on its own. And this is what brings us to the case of Dartmouth College v. Woodward, in which the Supreme Court was asked, can a state cancel a contract if it's acting in the public interest? And certainly you could argue that starting a new state college would be in the public interest, and that the charter had been issued by someone who was no longer ruling over the colonies. So in the end, the marshal and the court ended up saying, no, states can't, in the words of Article 1, Section 10, they can't just impair the obligations of contract single-handedly. If both parties were to agree to end a contract, well, that's fine. But one party can't just do it on their own, even if there's a compelling public interest. And this matters because the decision upheld what we call the sanctity of contract, which means that contracts are and will always be legally binding instruments. And the fact that the national government had asserted its power over New Hampshire, it was yet another decision that showed Marshall's strong belief in national supremacy. And each of these three cases is important because regardless of which party controls Congress or the presidency, Marshall maintained that the Supreme Court would always uphold the supremacy of the national government. Now, while all of that is important and it shows one area in which nationalism was clearly prevailing over sectionalism, other conflicts weren't so neatly resolved. Like slavery, for instance. So let's get caught up quickly on the slavery issue. Now, you will remember that the Northwest Ordinance had outlawed slavery in a large chunk of land controlled by the national government. But you probably also remember why Southern states didn't feel threatened at all by this law, and that they also didn't object the next year when the Constitution was ratified. The finished document of the Constitution never really addressed slavery, other than to say that the international slave trade could not be abolished for at least 20 years after ratification. And here again, Southern states were happy because, number one, they could import all the enslaved people they wanted for the next 20 years, and number two, if the slave trade were abolished, well, then the laws of scarcity would mean that each of their enslaved people would now be worth exponentially more because there would be fewer of them around available for sale. Of course, people who didn't like slavery weren't especially worried about all of this because, to be sure, slavery was kind of on the decline at this time. Some states had outlawed slavery after the Revolution, and other states seemed to be moving in that direction. So much so that there was a belief that maybe slavery was dying out on its own. And that belief proved fleeting because when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, it increased the speed and it cut the cost of cotton production considerably, so much so that enslavers vastly expanded their cotton plantations and brought in thousands and thousands of newly enslaved people to build this industry. You see, not all inventions are good inventions. But the expansion of the cotton industry contributed to the demand for more land, which is why so many enslavers were delighted by the Louisiana Purchase. They saw this vast expanse of land as a place to expand their agrarian empires and also expand the practice of slavery. It also probably explains why Northeasterners, especially those who didn't like slavery, found the Louisiana Purchase so threatening that they considered joining the Essex Junto. Now, as soon as 20 years had elapsed, Congress indeed outlawed the international slave trade. Mind you, they did not outlaw slavery, or even the domestic slave trade. They just outlawed the importation of any new enslaved people from other countries. And that scarcity made plantation owners incredibly wealthy. And they also made them incredibly hostile to any attempt at limiting or abolishing the practice of slavery. In 1819, after Andrew Jackson invaded Florida and John Quincy Adams had to swoop in and save the day with the Transcontinental Treaty, the result was that Florida, a territory in the deep South where slavery was practiced, would now be added to the Union. Indeed, it seemed that slavery was on the march, much to the consternation of Northerners who opposed the institution. Now, if you've been keeping track so far, you can see that most of the land that was added to the Union since the American Revolution was located in the South and in the West, two agricultural regions where the practice of slavery was certainly viable. But until 1820, the introduction of new states into the Union had led to a relative balance between the number of free states and the number of slave states. And as you can see from the map here, the dividing line for much of that country was the Ohio River, with slavery barred north of the river and practiced south of the river. But the Ohio emptied into the Mississippi. What if a new state wanted to come into the Union that was neither north nor south of the river, but west of it? And such was the case of Missouri, which applied for statehood in 1820, asking to be admitted as a slave state, a state where slavery was allowed. Southerners cheered, of course, but many Northerners worried that this might open the door to slavery in all of the Louisiana Purchase territory. And that explains why Ohio Senator named James Talmadge introduced the creatively named Talmadge Amendment. And what that amendment said was, okay, Missouri can come into the Union and allow the practice of slavery, but number one, no new enslaved people could be introduced into Missouri after ratification. And two, every enslaved person in Missouri would be freed as soon as they turned 25 years old. The amendment essentially said that Missouri could be a slave state for now, but with the eventual freeing of all enslaved people, it would one day become a free state. Unsurprisingly, Southern states shot this idea down, shot down this amendment, and the debate over the Missouri statehood continued. And so now we have to reintroduce ourselves to Henry Clay, the father of the American system and a person who was about to earn the nickname the Great Compromiser. Side note, he's also known as the Great Pacifier, but that makes him sound like he's a baby's binky, so it's not as good for his street cred. So let's call him the Great Compromiser. Anyway, his proposal said, okay, yes, Missouri can be a slave state, but to maintain the balance between slave and free states, the northern portion of Massachusetts, up by the Canadian border, would be sliced off to create a new state called Maine. But then, to avoid future conflicts over slavery, Congress would agree to draw a line west from the southern border of Missouri, a line at the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel. And any new states added that were north of this line would outlaw slavery, and any states south of the line would allow slavery. And everyone in Congress looked around at each other and they said, yeah, we can live with this. And so the Missouri Compromise was passed. Missouri and Maine joined the Union, and we never had to worry about having any conflicts over the issue of slavery ever again in American history. Asterisk. Actually, if you look at this slightly clearer map, you can see why there might be such future conflict. For one thing, the 3630 line was pretty far south, which severely limited the amount of new slave territory that could be added to the Union. Is it any wonder that pro-slavery forces started looking at Spanish Mexico, especially Texas, as a possible avenue for expansion? And the other indicator that Missouri Compromise might only be a temporary solution came from ex-President Thomas Jefferson. Upon hearing about the compromise, he said that the momentous question of slavery in the Western territories, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered the slavery issue as the death knell of the Union. Sure, the issue is hushed now for the moment, but it's a reprieve only, not the final sentence. So was Thomas Jefferson, the person who had bought this Western land in the first place, was he suggesting that the issue of slavery in the Western territories might one day split the nation, such that we might descend into a bloody civil war? Yes, that's precisely what he was suggesting. But as we move forward to consider the issues confronting the country in 1824, we can see that each of the three major regions of the country had different values, different priorities, and they wanted different things from their government. Northeastern states tended to be wealthier, more industrialized, with more immigrants and free, that is, yeoman, laborers. And so in 1824, they'd be looking for a candidate who was pro-business and pro-tariff. Meanwhile, southern states were more agrarian and they utilized more enslaved labor. So in this election, they would be looking for a president who would oppose tariffs, promote agriculture, and protect slavery. Out west, people tended to be free or yeoman farmers, and they wanted a candidate who would promote expansionism and the construction of those internal improvements, such as canals and roads. 3 different regions, 3 very different sets of priorities. As we can see, each region had its own preference for who should be president. Northerners tended to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams, the son of the former president, the person who was Secretary of State, who had written the Monroe Doctrine, and the person who had cleaned up Andrew Jackson's mess in Florida. Southerners lined up behind either John C. Calhoun, the pro-slavery senator from South Carolina, who had been the Secretary of War, or William Crawford, the pro-slavery Secretary of the Treasury from Georgia. Out west, you might think, well, this is Henry Clay's moment. After all, he had settled the Missouri Compromise question, and he had created the American system. But unfortunately, in 1824, there was an even more famous Westerner in the race, a war hero from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson. So here we would have it, 5 candidates for 3 regions. But who would win? Well, John C. Calhoun looked around and realized that it probably wasn't going to be him, and so he said, "I will drop out of the race if you all let me become vice president." And so that's exactly what happened. And that meant that there were only 4 candidates left on election day. Now, by this election, the number of states that had begun moving away from just letting their state legislatures choose the slate of electors, which is why in 1824 we actually have a tally of how many votes each candidate got in the popular election, at least in those states where voters were allowed to choose the slate of electors. So how did it go? Well, not surprisingly, in a country that loves to turn war heroes into presidents, Andrew Jackson earned the largest share of the votes in the election. Clearly, he was the choice of the American people. But of course, remember, the only vote that actually matters is not the popular vote, but the Electoral College. So how did that vote go? Well, here again, Andrew Jackson came out on top, with Adams in second place and poor Clay and Crawford lagging far, far behind. Okay, so Jackson's president, right? No, not so fast. Remember that in order to win the presidency, a candidate must earn a majority of the electoral votes. And 99 is certainly not a majority of 261. I did the math. And when no candidate gets the majority of electoral votes, the election has to be decided in the House of Representatives. And here is where things get messy. First, members of the House disqualified Crawford because he had had a serious stroke the previous year, and there was real concern that he might be physically unable to serve as president. And so it came down to the other 3. Now, because Henry Clay had come in 3rd place, he never really had a realistic chance of winning, but he was the Speaker of the House, and so he controlled the debate over the vote. And in the end, the House of Representatives chose to ignore the popular vote and ignore the Electoral College original vote, both of which had clearly shown that the people preferred Andrew Jackson, and instead, they named the man who had come in 2nd place, John Quincy Adams, as the next president of the United States. Immediately, supporters cried foul. Supporters of Jackson cried foul, declaring that Clay and Adams had made some corrupt bargain whereby Clay threw his support behind Adams in exchange for being named Secretary of State. Had they actually made a bargain? Well, we can't say that for sure, but what we do know is that after the election of 1824, the era of good feeling was over. One-party politics, it was nice while it lasted. But also, John Quincy Adams would turn out to be a very weak one-term president, perhaps because he could never outrun the charges that he had stolen the presidency away from Andrew Jackson. For his part, Henry Clay did become Secretary of State, which he hoped might help him springboard into the presidency in a future election. But what about Jackson? Well, considering his reputation as an uneducated, dueling, brawling, backwoods fighter, you might have expected him to kill some people. Instead, he created a new political party, first known as the Jacksonian Democrats and eventually known as the Democratic Party. And his party has been one of the two major political parties for 2 centuries now. And if you flip forward in the textbook a couple pages, you're going to discover that we have not seen the last of Andrew Jackson. But you have seen the last of this presentation. I hope you took great notes and learned something new. Thanks for taking the time to watch this presentation, and I'll see you on the other side of the screen.